During the morning roll call, a prisoner positions herself in the middle of the line. It is not by chance. The women around her have decided it without needing to discuss it aloud. She will stand in the center, surrounded by bodies, where the SS officer walking past and counting heads has less of an angle from which to notice the shape of her abdomen. Beneath her uniform, she wears a strip of cloth tied tightly enough to flatten what can no longer be completely concealed. She breathes shallowly. If the officer stops, if he asks a question, if he looks twice, what follows will not be a reprimand or a minor punishment. It is the possibility that they will kill her, or kill what she is carrying inside her, or kill them both. She has already spent weeks making the same calculation every morning. How many more days she can endure the tight cloth before her belly grows beyond what it can hide? How many more weeks of forced labor her body can withstand before hunger and childbirth begin competing at the same time for what little strength she has left? She does not know the exact word for what she feels each dawn when she hears the whistle. But if she had to name it, she would probably choose the same word later used by dozens of other women in the same situation: terror, inseparably mixed with the precise determination not to surrender yet. This scene, with only minor variations, was repeated hundreds of times at the Ravensbrück concentration camp between 1939 and 1945. The survivors, who later documented their strategies for concealing a pregnancy, described the same repertoire of gestures. The tightly bound cloth, the rigid posture used to tense the abdomen, the carefully calculated position within the formation, and the silent help of other prisoners who placed themselves around the woman like a human screen during inspections. It was not paranoia. It was an accurate reading of what the camp had been doing, with varying degrees of systematization, since the day it was founded. Ravensbrück was the largest concentration camp built specifically for women within the entire Nazi camp system. Located about 90 kilometers north of Berlin, beside a lake and surrounded by forests that still stand today, it began operating in May 1939, several months before the outbreak of the war, when the SS transferred there the female prisoners who had previously been held at Lichtenberg. Over the course of its existence, it held more than 130,000 women and children from some 20 different nationalities: Polish, French, Soviet, German, Czech, Hungarian, Roma, and Jewish women from a dozen occupied countries. According to the historical reconstruction carried out by researcher Rochelle Seidel, Jewish women represented around 20% of the camp's total population over the course of its history, a figure that included both women deported directly because they were Jewish and women classified under other categories, such as political prisoners or resistance members, who were also Jewish. Estimates of the total number of deaths in the camp vary depending on the source consulted, ranging from the 90,000 cited in some incomplete administrative records to higher figures that include prisoners who died after being transferred to other camps during the final months of the war. Of the 130,000 women who passed through Ravensbrück, Seidel estimates that barely 15,000 survived until the end of the conflict. That mortality rate places Ravensbrück, despite the fact that it was not originally designed as an industrialized extermination center comparable to the camps in the East, among the deadliest institutions in the entire Nazi concentration camp system. Within that general figure lies one specific chapter, documented only in fragments for decades, and reconstructed in greater detail only in recent years by historians who devoted themselves to tracing the few surviving records. What happened to women who arrived pregnant, or who became pregnant inside the camp itself, and to the children whom some of them managed to bring into the world in the worst possible place to do so? It is a chapter that remained largely absent from the first accounts written about Ravensbrück after the war, partly because many of the women involved chose to remain silent for decades, and partly because the documents that might have confirmed their stories were deliberately destroyed by the SS during the final weeks of the conflict. The first moment of real danger for any pregnant woman came before she had even crossed the entrance to the camp. Upon arrival, every new prisoner was subjected to a physical inspection that included, among other things, an examination for venereal disease and a superficial check intended to detect pregnancy. The Norwegian survivor Sylvia Salvesen, who arrived at Ravensbrück in July 1943, later recorded how these examinations were conducted collectively, without any privacy, in front of the other newly arrived women and the camp's medical personnel. A woman only a few weeks pregnant, who was not yet showing visible signs, might pass this first inspection without being detected. The problem began later, as the months passed and the body could no longer conceal what it was carrying. Salvesen, the wife of a Norwegian Lutheran pastor who had been arrested for her involvement in networks assisting prisoners of war, would eventually occupy a peculiar position within the camp's informal hierarchy. Thanks to her nursing training and to the limited diplomatic protection that Norway, as an occupied country not fully absorbed into the Reich's administrative machinery, afforded some of its deported citizens, Salvesen managed to establish a direct, though limited, channel of communication with Fritz Suren, the camp commandant for much of that period. Salvesen used this exceptional access on more than one occasion in an attempt to intercede on behalf of prisoners in desperate situations, including, according to her own account, pregnant women whose fate depended on administrative decisions that a camp commandant could alter with a single verbal order if he chose to do so. The real room for maneuver that Salvesen obtained was, according to her memoirs, minimal and profoundly inconsistent, dependent on Suren's mood and convenience in each individual case. Yet she documented at least a few specific instances in which her intervention succeeded in delaying or mitigating the fate of a pregnant prisoner, further evidence that even within the most rigid system there were cracks that certain individuals, under particular circumstances, managed to exploit. The first thing that must be understood is that for most of the camp's existence, becoming pregnant at Ravensbrück was not a neutral fact that the administration simply ignored. It was a condition that directly activated one of the most brutal mechanisms in the entire system. Until 1943, the consistently applied policy was forced termination of pregnancy, regardless of how far along the woman was. There are documented testimonies of abortions performed in the 8th month of pregnancy, meaning on fetuses that in any other medical context would have been considered viable outside the womb. The procedure followed no medical protocol recognizable beyond the camp. It was carried out without anesthesia, using invasive methods that included forced manual dilation and the injection of toxic substances directly into the uterus, with rates of complications, infections, and maternal deaths that no official record of the period bothered to quantify accurately. The physician responsible for many of these procedures during the early years was Rolf Rosenthal, the first male doctor, apart from the garrison's chief physician, to work inside the camp. He joined the staff in 1941. Testimonies collected after the war described Rosenthal as doing more than simply carrying out an administrative order. He actively experimented with different abortion procedures in order to document how the technique varied according to the stage of pregnancy, as though the women under his care were experimental material rather than patients. Gerda Quernheim, a German political prisoner who was involved in an intimate relationship with Rosenthal, regularly assisted him during these procedures, a circumstance that in itself reveals something about the way the camp system blurred every boundary between victim and collaborator. When a pregnancy reached full term before it could be terminated, or when birth occurred unexpectedly, the camp's policy during these first years was equally brutal in its logic, though different in its execution. Jewish and Roma newborns were killed almost automatically, usually by drowning or strangulation, and in a significant number of documented cases in front of their own mothers, who were forced to watch without being allowed to intervene. The requirement that the mother witness the killing served no administrative purpose. It was simply another form of punishment imposed on women whose only crime had been to give birth in the wrong camp. Slavic women, or women whose pregnancies resulted from relationships with Slavic men, Polish, Russian, or Yugoslav men, classified by Nazi racial ideology as a form of blood contamination, were systematically subjected to forced abortion, without the theoretical exceptions that might be applied to other categories of prisoners. The post-war testimony of Percival Trete, the physician who would later assume medical leadership of the camp, confirmed that he himself had performed at least 10 abortions on German women whose pregnancies had resulted from relationships with Jewish or foreign men before their arrival at the camp, relationships that the regime's racial bureaucracy classified under the term racial defilement. Why, then, did so many women risk absolutely everything to conceal what they were carrying, rather than resign themselves to a system that would probably discover them in the end? The answer later given by the survivors themselves was that concealing the pregnancy was not necessarily a strategy for avoiding abortion altogether, since many knew that if they were discovered in time, they would probably be forced to undergo it anyway. It was primarily a strategy for gaining time. Every week of pregnancy they managed to hide brought them closer to a birth that, if it happened late enough and discreetly enough, might escape systematic surveillance before the camp's bureaucratic machinery could intervene. The periodic medical inspections imposed by the camp administration at irregular intervals constituted another moment of constant danger for any woman attempting to hide her condition. These examinations, officially intended to control the spread of infectious diseases in a permanently overcrowded camp, were often carried out collectively, with entire groups of prisoners forced to undress in front of doctors and guards. For a pregnant woman, every inspection was a direct gamble. The further advanced the pregnancy, the less likely she was to pass through it without being identified. Some survivors later described pretending to suffer from minor illnesses, a persistent cough, a fabricated cold, in order to be excused from participating in the full collective examination, risking a lesser punishment for avoiding the procedure rather than exposing themselves directly to physical inspection. When concealment failed, the sequence of events that followed depended largely on the exact stage of the war in which the pregnancy was discovered. During the early years, until 1943, discovery almost certainly meant immediate transfer for forced termination, regardless of how advanced the pregnancy was or how close the expected date of birth might be. The prisoners who worked in the revier, the camp infirmary, as nurses or assistants, women who were themselves prisoners and had previous medical training, later described the silent terror of being forced to participate indirectly in procedures they knew to be cruel, fully aware that refusing to cooperate could cost them their relatively privileged position within the system, or something worse. The place where pregnancies were most frequently discovered was the revier, the camp infirmary, a space the prisoners learned to fear not only because of its miserable sanitary conditions, but because it was simultaneously the site of the best documented medical experiments in the entire Ravensbrück system and the location where periodic selections were carried out for the execution of prisoners considered no longer fit for work. Between 1942 and 1943, a group of Polish prisoners, many of them young university students arrested for participating in resistance movements, were subjected in that same revier to surgical experiments involving sulfonamides and procedures that included the deliberate removal of pieces of bone and muscle. These operations had no genuine therapeutic purpose and were carried out under the direct supervision of Karl Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's personal physician. Although these experiments were not specifically directed at pregnant women, their existence helped give the revier, among the rest of the camp population, the reputation of a place to be avoided for any possible reason. Pregnant prisoners knew that reputation perfectly well, and week after week it reinforced their decision to conceal their condition for as long as possible. For any prisoner, going to the revier meant entering a space where any visible physical condition, a fever, a wound, a pregnancy, could become the basis for a death sentence. Pregnant women therefore avoided the infirmary until the last possible moment, even when they desperately needed medical attention for other reasons, preferring to endure pain or illness rather than expose what they were hiding beneath their uniforms. In addition to binding cloth around the abdomen, survivors described other specific strategies for prolonging concealment. Some learned to alter the way they walked, avoiding any posture that emphasized the curve of the belly. Others used the wide, shapeless striped uniform itself as an involuntary ally. The loose cloth hanging from the skeletal bodies of most prisoners, the result of widespread malnutrition, also helped disguise the early months of pregnancy before the abdomen reached a size that no garment could hide. Several survivors agreed that the camp's chronic starvation, paradoxically, helped conceal pregnancies for longer than would have been possible under normal nutritional conditions, because the prisoners' extremely thin bodies delayed the visible emergence of the abdominal curve. In this particular context, solidarity among prisoners was one of the factors that most influenced how many women managed to sustain the deception long enough. In overcrowded barracks where 3 women might share a bunk designed for one person, there was virtually no form of genuine physical privacy. When barrack companions discovered that one of them was pregnant, they faced an immediate moral calculation. Report her, which in theory might reduce the risk of collective punishment if the SS later discovered that the others had known and failed to inform or protect her, accepting the shared risk of reprisals if the SS ultimately discovered the truth on its own. The overwhelming majority of testimonies collected after the war agree that, with isolated exceptions, the general response was protection. The prisoners placed the pregnant woman in the center during roll calls. They formed a wall of bodies during communal washing, when forced nudity made concealment impossible. And in a considerable number of documented cases, they sacrificed part of their own rations, already reduced to the limit of survival, so that the pregnant woman could receive slightly more food than the official system assigned her. The precise racial and national category of each woman determined, in practice, what kind of treatment her pregnancy received, even within a system that theoretically applied the same general rules to every prisoner. Pregnant Jewish women rarely arrived at Ravensbrück in numbers comparable to women of other nationalities, because the regime's general policy sent most Jewish deportees to the extermination centers in the East Auschwitz or the camps of the so-called Operation Reinhard, where immediate selection on the arrival ramp eliminated any possibility that a pregnancy would even be treated as a separate issue. The few Jewish women who did reach Ravensbrück while pregnant, generally because they had concealed their condition during transport, faced the most brutal treatment of all within the camp's racial classification system. If their children were born, they were killed almost automatically immediately after birth, without any of the partial exceptions that would later begin to apply to other categories of prisoners. Women assigned to the work detail responsible for sorting clothing and belongings confiscated from newly arrived prisoners held a position considered relatively privileged within the camp hierarchy. They worked indoors and occasionally gained access to garments of better quality than the standard uniform. From this position, they found an additional way to help pregnant women in their immediate circles. Scraps of softer cloth that could be turned into improvised diapers, baby clothes that occasionally appeared among the confiscated luggage of entire families deported together, thread and needles that could be used to alter uniforms as the abdomen grew. All these objects circulated secretly from that work detail to the barracks where pregnant women lived. Another informal network of solidarity generated as an involuntary response to the overcrowding and cruelty of the system itself. The turning point in the camp's official policy came in September 1943, when Percival Treite, a physician trained in gynecology, born to a British mother and a German father, became camp doctor after Rosenthal's departure. Treite reorganized much of the Revier's internal functioning, separating infectious diseases into different blocks and assigning prisoners with medical or nursing training to the daily care of patients, a reform that, in purely organizational terms, improved the camp's general sanitary conditions. With regard specifically to pregnancy, survivor testimonies, including that of Geneviève de Gaulle, niece of General Charles de Gaulle, and herself a prisoner at Ravensbrück, agree that under Treite's direction, the systematic and indiscriminate regime of forced abortions that had characterized the Rosenthal period was largely abandoned. According to her later testimony, Geneviève de Gaulle came to suspect that Treite simply did not share his predecessor's personal enthusiasm for carrying out abortions. Even so, after the war, Treite acknowledged that he had continued to terminate pregnancies among certain specific categories of prisoners, precisely those whose pregnancies violated the regime's strictest racial classifications. What changed in practice was that pregnancies were no longer automatically and indiscriminately terminated. Births began to be tolerated, provided they took place outside the direct view of the camp authorities and without requiring the administration formally to register them. This partial tolerance was less an act of institutional compassion than a reflection of practical reality. By 1944, the number of pregnant women arriving at the camp had increased so dramatically that maintaining a system of forced termination for all of them would have imposed a logistical and medical burden that the camp administration, already overwhelmed by overcrowding and epidemics, was no longer capable of sustaining. August 1944 marked the largest influx of pregnant women in the entire history of Ravensbrück. After the outbreak and brutal suppression of the Warsaw Uprising, the largest transports of pregnant Polish prisoners arrived at the camp, many of them in advanced stages of pregnancy, arrested with the rest of Warsaw's civilian population during the German reprisals. Among them was Waleria Paich, whose written testimony described how guards repeatedly beat and kicked her despite her advanced pregnancy immediately after her arrival. Paich survived both that initial violence and the epidemics sweeping through the camp during the final months of the war. On the 25th of March 1945, she gave birth to a son, whom she named Mikołaj. One of the few records to survive the systematic destruction of documents carried out by the SS in the final weeks before liberation was a notebook kept secretly by a Czech prisoner. In it, she recorded by hand 522 births that took place in the camp between September 1944 and April 1,945. Of those 522 entries, only 30 are not marked as deceased. The arithmetic of that notebook summarizes more clearly than any other available statistic the reality of what it meant to be born inside Ravensbrück, even during the period when births were no longer formally forbidden. Keeping the notebook was itself an act of courage, difficult to exaggerate. Any unauthorized writing material, any record systematically documenting what occurred inside the camp, was sufficient grounds for summary execution if discovered during one of the periodic barrack inspections. The woman who maintained the notebook did so knowing that if the SS found it among her belongings, she herself would become one of the figures that someone else would have to record. She continued anyway, week after week, because she understood that without that notebook, those 522 births, and above all the 30 lives that managed to continue beyond the camp, would have left no documentary trace from which the events could later be reconstructed. Even during the months in which pregnancy remained concealed, forced labor did not stop. Pregnant women working at the electrical components factory that Siemens had installed within the Ravensbrück complex later described the constant effort required to hide their additional exhaustion, nausea, and dizziness from foremen who made no allowances for the workers' physical condition. The German company, which employed several thousand camp prisoners in the production of components for the armaments industry, maintained its own production quotas. Falling behind those quotas for any reason, including a pregnancy that could not be mentioned aloud, exposed the prisoner to the same punishment as any other form of poor performance. Babies who survived childbirth then faced a logistical problem that the camp had never officially solved. There was not enough milk. There was no adequate warm clothing for newborns during German winters. There was no formal childcare structure within a system designed entirely for the exploitation and punishment of adults. Once again, the prisoners themselves improvised what the administration refused to provide. Women who had lost their own children, or who had never had children, took on informal roles in collective childcare. They shared shifts watching newborns while the mothers completed the same 12 to 14-hour forced labor days imposed on the rest of the camp's 130,000 prisoners, carrying bricks, pushing carts, sewing uniforms, or working in the electrical components factory operated by Siemens within the Ravensbrück complex. Decades later, some of the babies who survived, by then adults, referred to those women, using an expression that captured the kind of bond formed under such circumstances: "my camp mothers." From September 1944 onward, faced with the steady increase in births, the camp administration authorized the creation of a specific space for newborns, an emptied barrack reserved exclusively for them, which the prisoners themselves called the Kinderzimmer, the children's room. The logic behind the decision was not humanitarian. The SS had noticed that mothers forced to leave their babies without supervision during their work shifts lost a significant part of their productive capacity because of anxiety and lack of sleep. Concentrating the newborns in a single place allowed the mothers, at least in theory, to return to a level of labor performance closer to what was required of them. Marie-Josée Chambard Delaue, a medical student and member of the French resistance deported to Ravensbrück, became one of the prisoners responsible for trying to keep the Kinderzimmer babies alive. She later described, in testimony that became one of the most frequently cited sources on this particular episode, that the life expectancy of a newborn inside that room did not exceed 3 months. The prisoners caring for the babies improvised diapers from rags and made feeding bottles by cutting the fingers from rubber gloves and using them as nipples, because the camp supplied nothing actually designed for infant care. At night, with no one watching, rats bit the newborns' fingers while they slept. Chambard Delaue described them as little old people with wrinkled skin, swollen bellies from malnutrition, and triangular faces belonging to bodies that no longer had reserves of fat to sustain them. They suffered from abscesses and green diarrhea, a characteristic symptom of the severe intestinal infections that spread through the camp. The head nurse responsible for the infirmary, who administered, among other things, the supplies theoretically intended for the Kinderzimmer, was Elisabeth Marschall, the chief SS nurse at Ravensbrück. Later, survivor testimonies accused her of hoarding for her own use much of the humanitarian aid sent by the International Red Cross, which was theoretically intended to improve the nutrition of the most vulnerable prisoners, including newborns, but in practice never reached the children's room in sufficient quantities. The Polish prisoner Hanna Wasilczenko, whose son Witold Grzegorz had been born in the camp, later described stealing the key to the Kinderzimmer so that she could enter at night and see her own baby, something the camp rules prohibited. What she found that night, according to her account, was a scene she could never forget for the rest of her life. In the darkness, vermin of every kind jumped between the beds and crawled into the baby's noses and ears. Most of them were naked because their blankets had fallen away. They cried from hunger, and no one listened. We told Gregors died of pneumonia 16 days after he was born. According to the incomplete surviving records, of the first 100 babies born and taken to the Kinderzimmer, not one was still alive 30 days later. It is estimated that more than 800 babies were born at Ravensbrück over the course of the war. The overwhelming majority died within weeks from hunger, infection, or exposure to cold, in a barrack whose very name, the children's room, became one of the bitterest ironies in the entire administrative vocabulary of the camp. Among the few who survived was a boy named Manfred, born in the camp under circumstances described in his baptismal documents, preserved after the war by his family, only by the exact date and place of birth. Ravensbrück. Cases like his, documented through birth and baptism certificates written inside the camp by chaplains or barrack companions willing to improvise any form of record that might later serve as legal proof, became over time some of the few physical documents available for reconstructing, case by case, the actual number of births that occurred inside Ravensbrück. The conditions documented in the Kinderzimmer, including Marie-Josée Chambard de Laue's detailed descriptions of the deliberate lack of food and Elizabeth Marshall's hoarding of Red Cross supplies, later became part of the evidence presented during the Ravensbrück trials. Marshall was prosecuted specifically for her responsibility in administering that room. Testimonies from survivors such as Hanna Wasilchenko, who had personally witnessed the barracks' nighttime conditions, proved decisive in establishing before the court that the mass death of the newborns was not an inevitable consequence of general wartime scarcity, but the direct result of specific administrative decisions made by identifiable individuals. Chambard de Lauve survived the camp and returned to France, where she resumed and completed her academic training, this time in social psychology. She devoted much of the following decades to studying the long-term psychological effects of deportation and captivity, becoming one of the most frequently cited academic voices in France on the memory of the Nazi concentration camp system. She also played an active role in survivors' organizations that fought for years to ensure that episodes such as the Kinderzimmer did not remain reduced to a footnote in the broader history of Ravensbrück. Her testimony, written with the methodological rigor of someone who had begun her career as a medical student before deportation, became the primary source most frequently cited by historians who, decades later, attempted to reconstruct with precision what had taken place inside that particular room. Childbirth itself, when it finally came, almost always took place under conditions that bore no resemblance to even the minimum medical standard. There were no dedicated delivery rooms. There were no sterile instruments, not even a constant guarantee of hot water. Women gave birth on the same wooden boards used as bunks, sometimes assisted by fellow prisoners with previous medical training, nurses or doctors deported for political reasons, who practiced within the camp a kind of wartime medicine without any of the resources available even on a conventional battlefield. At other times, when no medically trained prisoner was available, childbirth took place with only the help of other barrack companions, women with no specific training who improvised whatever they could remember from births they had witnessed within their own families before deportation. Postpartum infections were extremely common in an environment without even basic hygiene. Without access to antibiotics, any infection could become a death sentence as lethal as any official SS selection. Women who survived childbirth knew that the hours and days immediately afterward posed a danger almost as great as the birth itself. Even when childbirth was tolerated and the baby survived the first days, the relationship between mother and child inside the camp remained extremely precarious. Forced labor did not stop because a woman had given birth. At best, a new mother received only a minimal period of rest before being expected to return to her work detail, leaving the newborn in the care of other prisoners for the rest of the day. The mother's severe malnutrition, despite receiving scarcely more calories than any other prisoner while trying to breastfeed, meant that many could not produce enough milk. The babies then depended on improvised substitutes, sugar water when sugar was available, or simply the hope that another woman in the barrack, herself malnourished, might be able to share some of her own milk. During the final months of the war, as the Red Army advanced relentlessly westward, The SS decided to accelerate the elimination of as many prisoners as possible in an attempt to reduce the number of living witnesses who might later describe what had happened inside the camp. In early 1945, a gas chamber was installed at Ravensbrück, an installation the camp had lacked for most of its existence, and which was added to the complex specifically to increase the rate of killing during those final weeks. The construction of this chamber near the camp crematorium contradicted the image Ravensbrück had projected for much of the war, that of a severe forced labor camp without industrialized extermination facilities comparable to Auschwitz or the camps of Operation Reinhard. Its installation in the final months of the conflict reflected a shift in priorities among the SS leadership. At that stage, the aim was no longer primarily to extract labor from the prisoners, but to eliminate as many witnesses as possible before Soviet or Western forces arrived to liberate the camp. According to the available records, in March 1945, 130 babies and pregnant women were murdered in that facility. In one of the final and least known episodes in the camp's history, only weeks before Soviet troops finally crossed the entrance. A few days before that Soviet liberation, a very different episode managed to save a small group of mothers and babies by an entirely different route. Between April 23 and 25, 1945, the Swedish Red Cross, as part of an agreement negotiated directly by Count Folke Bernadotte with Heinrich Himmler, who in the final weeks of the war was attempting to ingratiate himself with the Western Allies, organized the evacuation of approximately 7,500 female prisoners from Ravensbrück to Sweden in the vehicles later remembered as the White Buses. Sylvie Aylmer, one of the babies born in the camp, and Guy Poirot, another child born at Ravensbrück who was not related to her by blood but was linked to her through their shared place of birth, managed to board those buses hidden beneath the skirts of several evacuated prisoners. It was an improvised last-minute strategy intended to make the children appear to be part of the women's personal belongings and prevent them from attracting attention during the final SS inspections at the camp gate. Most of the babies who survived until the end were born precisely during the days immediately preceding liberation, which occurred during the night of April 29 to 30, 1945, when the Red Army finally took control of the camp. By then, many of the prisoners who were still able to walk had already been forced to march toward the Malchow subcamp, 60 kilometers away, in one of the last death marches organized by the SS before the camp system collapsed completely. Ingelor Prochnow, born at Ravensbrück, almost a year before several of the other documented surviving babies, was one of the children forced to cover those 60 kilometers toward Malchow with her mother during the final hours of the conflict. Many of the children who survived later grew up without knowing the exact circumstances of their birth. Sylvie Aylmer, another survivor born inside the camp, would recall decades later that for much of her childhood, she had been led to believe that Ravensbrück was simply a village in France. Only as an adult did she discover the full truth about the place where she had come into the world. That silence was neither accidental nor careless. The mothers who had given birth at Ravensbrück carried, alongside the relief of survival, a particular kind of pain that many chose not to pass on to their children for decades, the memory of other women in the same bunk, in the same barrack, whose babies had not shared the same fate. To tell the story of one's own survival almost always required explaining why so many other births had ended differently, an explanation for which many of those mothers never found the right words, either in public or within their own families. A French historian who devoted much of her academic career to documenting the fate of pregnant women in Nazi camps noted in works published several decades after the war that reconstructing these events depended almost entirely on oral histories collected very late, when the women themselves were beginning to die. She concluded that a significant part of what had happened at Ravensbrück in relation to pregnancy and childbirth was probably lost forever with the women who chose to take their experiences with them. Among the prisoners, there was also a particular group whose experience differed from that of all the others. Women who had received medical training before their deportation and were forced to work in the Revier under the supervision of Rosenthal, Treite, and the rest of the SS medical personnel. Several later described the ethical conflict involved in being required, even indirectly, to assist in procedures that their professional training had taught them to regard as violations of every basic medical principle. Some found small margins of resistance within the system, deliberately delaying the moment at which a detected pregnancy was reported, exaggerating the difficulty of a procedure in order to gain time, or discreetly giving the patient information that allowed her to anticipate what was about to happen and prepare herself, as far as possible, for what would follow. None of these gestures altered the final result of the system as a whole. But for the individual women who benefited from them, they sometimes represented the difference between a procedure that was brutal but survivable and one that was not. Percival Traité was arrested after the war by Allied military authorities and tried by a British military court as part of the so-called Ravensbrück trials, a series of 7 proceedings held in Hamburg between 1946 and 1948 against SS personnel and doctors who had worked at the camp. These trials, less well known today than the main Nuremberg proceedings against the regime's leading figures, were the first to present before an international tribunal a detailed and sustained account of the specifically female experience within the Nazi camp system, including testimony concerning pregnancy, forced abortion, and the deaths of newborns, which until then had not formed part of the public record of war crimes. Sentenced to death, Traité killed himself in his cell in 1947 before the sentence could be carried out, taking with him any possibility that he might answer in greater detail for the exact extent of his responsibility in the forced abortion policy he had inherited, moderated, but never completely abolished. Rolf Rosenthal was also tried and convicted for his role in the abortion procedures carried out during the camp's early years, while Gerda Quernheim, the prisoner who had assisted him in those same procedures, faced a separate trial in which her own status as a victim of the system and her role as Rosenthal's direct collaborator generated a legal debate that the courts of the period never resolved entirely satisfactorily. Today, the site of the former Ravensbrück camp operates as a memorial and museum administered by the German state of Brandenburg. Among its permanent exhibitions is a room specifically dedicated to the births that occurred inside the camp, containing photographs of some of the few babies who survived, donated decades later by their own children or grandchildren, as well as a copy of the birth notebook secretly kept by the Czech prisoner. Each year, a shrinking number of survivors and their descendants return to the site for commemorative ceremonies. Among them are some of the children born in the camp, who today, in the final stage of their own lives, are among the last living witnesses capable of saying with direct authority that they were there, even though they themselves can remember nothing of it. The nationality and detention category assigned to each woman also affected her chances of receiving treatment that was relatively less brutal within a system that was already brutal in its entirety. Political prisoners, identified by the SS with a red triangle sewn onto their uniforms, tended to have better organized internal solidarity networks than women assigned to other categories. This was partly because many had arrived at the camp already integrated into political resistance structures that predated their arrest. Inside the camp, those structures became mutual support networks, capable of coordinating, for example, the kind of collective vigilance during roll calls that allowed a pregnancy to remain concealed for longer. Women classified as asocials, a broad and arbitrary category applied by the SS to women whose moral or social conduct was considered unacceptable according to the regime's standards, and common criminal prisoners, identified by triangles of other colors, generally had weaker internal support networks. In practice, this meant a lower chance that their pregnancies would remain undetected long enough. Compared with what happened in other concentration camps within the Nazi system, Ravensbrück is distinctive precisely because, for much of the war, it was the only camp with a predominantly female prison population, large enough for pregnancy to become a recurring administrative problem for the SS itself. At Auschwitz, the overwhelming majority of pregnant women arriving on transports were sent directly to the gas chamber during selection on the arrival ramp, without their condition ever being recorded as a separate issue within the logic of immediate extermination governing that complex. At Ravensbrück, by contrast, because there was no comparable infrastructure of mass extermination for most of its history, pregnancy became a problem the camp administration had to manage actively, year after year, through policies that changed, hardened, and softened erratically depending on who controlled the revier at any given moment. That structural difference partly explains why the specific history of pregnancy and childbirth at Ravensbrück offers a kind of documentation that does not exist and cannot exist for the overwhelming majority of the extermination camps in the East. This historical reconstruction also remains incomplete and is still actively developing. Contemporary researchers continue to locate scattered documents in German, French, and Polish regional archives, cross-referencing parish baptismal records with deportation lists, and interviewing the last direct descendants of women who gave birth inside the camp. Before that generation of indirect witnesses also begins to disappear. Every new document recovered, every new birth certificate written by hand inside a barrack 80 years ago, adds another name to a list that, by its very nature, will probably never be considered complete. Within the broader history of the Holocaust and the Nazi concentration camp system, the story of pregnancy at Ravensbrück occupies a particular and specific place precisely because every documented detail challenges later attempts at moral simplification. It is not a story of uniformly cruel villains confronting uniformly helpless victims, although the profound structural cruelty of the system is undeniable in every detail documented over the decades. It is also the story of an SS nurse who hoarded food intended for dying babies while carrying out her ordinary administrative duties each day, and at the same time the story of a doctor who, without ever ceasing to be a collaborator in the system whose uniform he wore, moderated a practice that his predecessor had taken to the most brutal possible extreme. It is the story of thousands of anonymous women who risked their own lives and their own food rations to protect others whose names they barely knew. It is also the story of the cold, calculated arithmetic with which the same system measured how many additional rations it could tolerate without causing the camp's daily production to decline visibly in the eyes of its superiors in Berlin. None of these different layers contradicts the others. They all coexisted, at the same time, within that fenced perimeter. 75 years after Waleria Paich gave birth to her son Mikołaj only weeks before liberation, and 80 years after the Czech prisoner wrote birth number 522 inches her secret notebook in cramped handwriting, trembling from the cold and the constant fear of discovery, the question that remains open for historians working with this material is not so much how many women underwent this specific experience at Ravensbrück, a figure that will probably never be established with absolute precision. The question is how many similar stories, in other camps, in other countries, under other comparable regimes of terror, remain incompletely documented, waiting for someone to find the right notebook, the right baptismal certificate, or the last survivor willing to speak before silence becomes final. After the war, when the first accounts of Nazi crimes against civilian populations began to be systematized before international tribunals, the specific persecution of pregnant women did not fit easily into any of the legal categories that existed at the time. The concept of crimes against humanity, still being developed during the Nuremberg trials, had not been designed specifically with forced reproduction, forced abortion, or systematic infanticide in mind as distinct forms of persecution. It was the Ravensbrück trials themselves, and the decades of historical research that followed, that contributed to the much later recognition of these acts as specific and autonomous forms of gender-based violence in contexts of armed conflict and genocide. A legal framework applied today by international tribunals, but only beginning to take shape in 1946. What remains 80 years later is not a definitive figure for the number of pregnant women who passed through Ravensbrück or the number of their children who survived, because the SS's deliberate destruction of records during the final weeks of its control ensured that such a figure could never be reconstructed with absolute precision. What remains is the notebook of a Czech prisoner who decided, at the risk of her own life, to record 522 births that the system would otherwise have preferred to erase completely. And what remains is the memory, passed down in fragments from one generation to the next, of women who positioned themselves in the center of the roll call line, breathing shallowly, silently calculating how many more days they needed to endure without being discovered. Of the roughly 1,700 days during which the camp operated, there is not a single documented day on which some pregnant prisoner did not have to make that same silent calculation at some point between dawn and night, how much time she had left, how much she could still hide, and whether, when the moment came that concealment was no longer possible, there would be someone beside her willing to help preserve, even for only a few more days, the possibility that her child might be born alive in the worst place the 20th century had created for anyone to be born. After liberation, the few babies who had survived still faced one final period of uncertainty before their stories could truly be considered safe. Many of their mothers, weakened to the physical limit by months or years of starvation and forced labor, were not capable of immediately beginning the journey back to their countries of origin. A journey that in the devastated Europe of mid-1945 could take weeks and expose mothers and children to new epidemics, widespread food shortages, and the chaotic bureaucracy of a continent only beginning to reorganize itself. International relief organizations, including the Red Cross, attempted to coordinate the transfer of the most fragile survivors to Allied field hospitals. But logistical priority inevitably went first to the most urgent medical cases, leaving some mothers with newborns waiting for weeks before they could begin the journey home. For many of those women, returning home also meant confronting a question that no Allied country had anticipated or knew how to answer clearly: what to do, in legal and administrative terms, with a child conceived before the mother's deportation, born inside a concentration camp, and lacking any official document certifying the birth in the manner that any other state would have required under normal post-war circumstances. Some European governments took literally years to recognize formally these births in captivity, forcing the mothers, already rebuilding their civilian lives from nothing, to prove sometimes, with the assistance of other survivors willing to testify before notaries and officials who doubted their words, that their children had been born exactly where they said they had been born, in the worst possible place. And yet, against every reasonable expectation created by the circumstances of their arrival in the world, had been born alive. Each time, one of them speaks in a school, in a documentary, or at a commemorative ceremony beside the lake where the Ravensbrück Memorial still stands, the act fulfills, quite literally, the purpose the Czech prisoner had assigned to her secret notebook 80 years earlier: to leave a record that they were born, that someone counted them one by one, and that the system which attempted to erase them from history, with all the machinery of an entire state at its disposal, ultimately did not entirely succeed.